The wheel of time moves slowly in this ancient land. The past is a step behind the present, and the future retakes some steps from the past. This wheel of time also reflects the cycles of life, moving from birth through death to reincarnation. Like the endless voyage of the sun across the sky and into the underworld of the night, but also to another dawn. Each new generation on the wheel creates its own meaning for these timeless mysteries, building on the wisdom of their ancestors. To truly understand ourselves, we must know the foundation of thought that built Western civilization, because from the beginning, there was Egypt. This is a journey back to those ancient roots. Removing the blinders of the modern mind, profound knowledge can still be learned here. It emanates from this land like a distant beacon, and that could be the key to our survival in the future. The guide will be the River Nile. Its natural beauty has been compared to a long-stemmed lotus flower, blossoming at the northern delta. Its lengthy course likened to a spinal column connecting Upper and Lower Egypt. The religious temples along its banks are like chakras in the body that reflect the focal points of energy within us. The element which represents our emotions is water, and with blended currents from the white and blue Nile of Sudan, flows as one into Egypt. Guarding the Nile's arrival as it deposits this spiritual life force into the motherland are the spectacular seated statues of Ramesses II. At a distance, they just appear as the humanized expression of the natural rock cliff from which they are cut. But close up, they mystify the viewer with their superhuman size and the look of timeless serenity on their faces. These four colossi of the legendary pharaoh represent the cardinal directions and the presence of their solar deity on Earth. They are governed from above by the falcon-headed god, Horus, while being governed below by a symbolic god, the pharaoh, a perfected human. Beyond the imposing facade set into the mountain is a temple complex, and beyond chambers depicting the glories of Pharaoh, there is the inner temple. Twice a year, the sun's rays will pierce its darkness to illuminate statues of a deified pharaoh Ramses and the gods Ptah, Amun, and Ra-Horakhti. This living architecture is now revitalized once again. Facing Ramesses' temple is one dedicated to his wife Nefertari and the cosmic love goddess Hathor, wife of the god Horus. The two temples are a celebration of both an earthly and celestial marriage, as well as an acknowledgement of the masculine and feminine aspects in nature. Other temples along the Nile explore this concept with different gods and goddesses. The journey officially starts at the gateway to Egypt. Here we find the famous pink granite from which many obelisks were cut. This uncompleted one would have been the largest. Aswan also has a substantial population of ethnic Nubians who still cling to their own language and customs from the past. Not far from here, one of the most picturesque temples in Egypt sits on an island in the Nile. To the ancient Egyptians, this was a temple dedicated to the archetypal personification of women as a divine entity, the great goddess Isis. She also symbolized the Sirius star rising in the summer sky and yearly Nile flood. Past the exquisite floral top columns, we humbly stand before the entrance to her mysteries. For the temple walls speak of the role Isis played in the mystical process of death and spiritual rebirth, which forms the center of ancient Egyptian religious beliefs. The myth explaining her role in this process states that when her husband, the god Osiris, was killed and dismembered, it was her magical powers of regeneration which brought him back from the dead to rule the underworld, the Duat. Symbolically, Isis gathers together the lost fragments of a person's spiritual nature and gives birth to a new awareness of the soul's divine origin. Her mysteries allow the seeker insight into the workings of the spiritual dimension in our world. Her qualities of faithful wife, loving mother, and ruling queen were exalted across the Mediterranean. Beliefs about the Virgin Mary share some interesting similarities to those usually associated with Isis, such as the mother of a god. Her temple became a Christian church for a time. There are several distinctive temples encountered when traveling north on the Nile. From a metaphysical perspective, each could signify a higher note on the scale of creation and together an unfolding process for the spirit in nature, exemplified by the particular temple god or goddess. The unique structure of this notable temple embodies its esoteric wisdom and portrays an important philosophical concept of the ancient Egyptians: duality. Demonstrated here is the concept that something could not be truly known unless its opposite was measured or defined against it. Following this principle, the temple is divided in its construction for two opposing gods, with two separate entrances and sanctuaries. The matching altar stones also reflect this odd arrangement. The north side is the domain of Horus, represented as a falcon-headed man, a sky god, an enlightened being, a rebel, liberator and warrior. The south side is the domain of Sobek, the crocodile-headed deity, and another manifestation taken by the god Seth, the mythic adversary of Horus. Since he was such a despised god in ancient Egyptian history, his presence here is disguised, but nevertheless implicit in the temple design. Seth might represent our divisive rational mind that limits our true potential for enlightenment. The duality between these two gods, constructed as a parallel unity within the architecture, can also be indicative of our own symbiotic nature. The human brain is divided into two hemispheres. The left side is the realm of analytical and logical thinking, while the right commands our creative and intuitive abilities. In this temple, as in ourselves, each must be acknowledged accordingly, and understood for their deeper meaning and influence. their history, the ancient Egyptians even depicted Horus and Seth as one god with two heads. Horus has his own temple, and it is one of the best preserved temples from antiquity. Virtually intact, it was dedicated to a god whose origins date further back than the 3,000 years of dynastic Egypt. There are many curious legends dramatized by this mighty god. In his multiple incarnations, he was the son of Isis, wife of Hathor, avenger of his father Osiris and conqueror of the god of darkness, Seth. Past the outer pylon depicting the victories of this glorious god, and the 32 columns of the Great Court, the austere presence of a crowned falcon statue guards the entrance to the inner sanctuaries. Horus heralds the dawn of a new age of expanded consciousness that replaces the old order as embodied by his rival, Seth. This is also a family power struggle because Seth is his uncle. Horus as victor becomes king over Upper and Lower Egypt. His eye lost in battle is restored and becomes an eternal symbol for protection against evil, the infamous Eye of Horus. The striking similarities between Horus and Jesus Christ, who also was conceived in a virgin birth and is a son of God and humanity's savior, show how religions can seamlessly transition from their predecessors' beliefs. Horus represents the direct path to attaining a higher state of enlightenment and acts like a catalyst for our evolution that strives to unify human and divine elements into a perfected being in company with the gods. The dusty streets of this quaint town reveal a simple but fascinating way of life. Some things here are still being done by hand or foot. At its center, about 30 feet below street level, in a large pit, lies the town's main attraction. Only half excavated, this temple was dedicated to a ram-headed god, Khunuam, known as the potter who molded mankind out of clay. His mythology is similar to the biblical story of creation in Genesis. Khunuam performs a very specific function in this process. The ancient Egyptian method for rationally expressing a formative process of our world was to anoint it with a god or goddess. The ram, its essential animal characteristics symbolizing Kunyum's nature, has been utilized by other religions to express the spiritual personality of the dogma, like the blowing of the ram's horn that awakens the senses of the people to an awareness of divinity. The expansive panorama of the Nile subtly expands our vision of reality. At the geodesic center of Egypt, known as Thebes to the ancient Greeks, can be found the once majestic capital of the New and Middle Kingdom dynasties. It lasted for approximately 1500 glorious years. When the astrological age of Aries began, the symbolic animal at the time shifted from the bull of Taurus to the ram, and with such change a new god arose, Amun, who embodied the distinctive perspective of this era. The Karnak complex was dedicated to Amun, having temples for wife and son, Mut and Khonsu as well. It is truly a living monument of stone suspended in time that reveals to us the age of Aries in all its greatness and splendor. Here the mystical act of creation itself was physically embodied in the architecture, and at the height of its power, spanning centuries, Karnak reflected this by being in a constant state of construction and demolition, life and death. A moment's meditation in the Great Hypostyle Hall reveals a forest of gigantic papyrus columns, 134 in all. The center has 12 flowering tops. Those flanking them are closed, ready to bud, making a triumphal procession through them, like a pharaoh of the day, overwhelms a visitor with its magnificence. It is similar to a primordial marsh, where nature's bounty can be experienced in all its glory and wonder. The sight of the noble obelisk focuses attention forward. A possible reason for the use of the obelisk is that it acted as the temple's conductor of subtle energies, flowing from above and below. Passing ruined pylons, beyond exquisite fragments of statues and engravings, the nucleus of the temple is reached at the inner sanctum of Amun. In straight alignment with the distant temple entrance, the rays of the setting sun at winter solstice penetrate this sanctuary. It unites Amun with the solar god Ra, combining two procreative functions into one god, Amun-Ra. At an adjacent temple built by Ramesses III, towering statues of Osiris equate the pharaoh with this legendary king of the underworld. Connected to the south side of the main temple and at a right angle are a dazzling array of pylons and colossal statues acting as an umbilical cord between Amun's temple and the one for his wife, Muth. The temple of Khonsu, the son of Amun and Muth, is remarkable for its simplicity and clarity of construction. The family role of this symbolic lunar god reflects the periodic phases of the moon, the same as the menstrual cycle of this small monkey. The view from Karnak's sacred lake illustrates the ancient Egyptians' quest for a reflection of the spiritual world on earth. Connected by an avenue sphinxes is Karnak's sister temple to the south. It is smaller in size but actually much larger if observed from a metaphysical perspective. Also dedicated to the great god Amun, his name whispered at the end of every prayer. Luxor Temple focuses on his role in nature as the elusive spark of life, the seed that initiates creation at every stage of development. However, it has stood in the shadow of Karnak, misunderstood. Viewed in a different light from the symbolic approach proposed by the late metaphysical scholar R. A. Schwaller de Lubitsch in his book Temple of Man, we stand before an architectural miracle. After years of intensive research, he concluded from mathematical calculations that Luxor was actually built in proportion to a man, encompassing in its design the organs of the body and the functions. This was deduced from wall reliefs and a schematic layout of the entire complex, especially the chambers surrounding the inner sanctuary, the symbolic head. But the temple ends where the upper hemispheres of the brain begin, the areas of our rational faculties, or personal ego. Luxor speaks of an ancestral man, similar to Adam in the Bible, who had direct access to the inner workings of nature. As Western science strives to master and manipulate the external forces of nature, the sacred science of Egypt, symbolically built into Luxor Temple, provides a diagram for our relationship with them. As the east bank of the Nile was the land of the living, the west bank where the sun vanished was the domain of the dead. It was also an arena for transformation where the immortal soul was liberated from the bondage of the flesh, free again to rediscover its divine origin. The colossi of Memnon, two gigantic statues of Amenhotep III, guard our approach into the ancient Egyptian conception of an afterlife, especially as it related to the human image of God on earth, the pharaoh. Ancient Egypt is unique amongst past civilizations for granting women more equal rights with men. Therefore, it is fitting to begin at the mortuary temple of the only reigning queen who crowned herself pharaoh. This temple structure subtly draws the viewer towards it by skillfully blending into the rock cliff backdrop, creating a stunning vision, a stairway to heaven. Hatshepsut identified with the goddess Hathor and her divine virtues of peace, love, and happiness. These are the qualities of a benevolent leader and may have influenced her role as pharaoh. Nearby are the mortuary temples of pharaohs Seti I and Ramesses II. Called the Ramesseum, this temple reflects his legacy as a prolific builder. Wall engravings reflect the pharaoh's idealized stature as the victor of a fictitious battle. Viewed in a symbolic context, Pharaoh's role as God's earthly representative was to crush the forces of chaos illustrated as Egypt's enemies. At Medinet Habu, mortuary temple of Ramesses III. This theme is continued. Nestled between these stark mountains, their rock faces reflecting the colors of the day, are the actual burial places for the New Kingdom pharaohs, traditionally known as the Valley of the Kings. The crypt of Seti I, cut deep into the mountain, can overwhelm the visitor with imagery detailing the soul's passage through the underworld, or night sky of death. The descending entrance into the tomb of Ramesses VI is decorated with funeral literature interpreted from an ancient text commonly identified as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This work metaphysically explains hour by hour the soul's journey in the afterlife and the perils it confronts by supernatural demons and sudden challenges. Here in the Valley of the Queens is the tomb of a young prince. The inner walls exhibit an impressive lifelike company of gods, these guardians of the soul, and initiators of the rituals of rebirth. The ancient Egyptians looked at the soul as having a dual nature with both a personal and a universal aspect. In the sequence of events after death, the two may be reunited in the dawning of a luminous immortal being, like the birth of a new star. Not only Pharaoh was allowed an elaborate burial in this New Kingdom period. Prominent nobles prepared their own tombs, and their vivid murals have provided scholars a rare glimpse into everyday Egyptian life, which also formed the basis for their conception of an afterlife. Rising up from the fertile farmland along the Nile, this towering temple gate is another doorway to which the ancient Egyptian mysteries can be contemplated. Now from the perspective of the goddess Hathor. This Egyptian temple, like many others, was also aligned with the helical rising of a certain star in the night sky, creating a special bond with the universe above, and infusing this temple with the star's spiritual guiding light. At the temple's birth house, a young pharaoh was baptized into his divine role as living god. Dendera was constructed in the 1st century BC by the Ptolemies, Greek occupiers of Egypt, and like Philae and Edfu, upon the site of an earlier temple. Walking around its exterior, one becomes part of a parade of gods in company with Hathor. They seem to activate a movement of subtle energies flowing around its perimeter. The temple is remarkably well preserved. A distinctive feature of its entrance hall is an array of goddess columns. The top of this Hathor head column design has the shape of a sistrum, an ancient musical instrument. This cult object, usually played by women, was believed to awaken life by the stirring sounds it produced. As a primordial female identity, she differed from the goddess Isis in her more personal, human nature. Hathor is a nourishing goddess who perpetually conceives and gives birth to the light. Her name literally means House of Horus, and like the name Isis, which translates as throne, the ancient Egyptians viewed the feminine principle in nature as giving shape to the masculine. on the temple roof, possibly used as an observatory, was found the famous zodiac. It details the precession of the equinoxes. These are periods of about 2,000 years when a new constellation moves into a position facing the Earth. They are also considered astrological ages that influence our development, like the age of Aries, the ram on display at Karnak. There was an annual marriage celebration for Hathor and Horus. Her shrine was taken by boat with much pomp and pageantry to be united with her husband Horus at Edfu. This was the ultimate cosmic union of solar and lunar personalities, with their love child being the god of music. The formidable presence of this temple facade is nothing less than the gateway to the underworld, a threshold to the mysterious, metamorphic process of death. Passing through to the other side, the soul is temporarily lost in a twilight world seeking the redemption of the light. Here it is confronted by the king of this shadowy domain, Osiris, and judged worthy of eternal life or face rejection. The myths around Osiris reflect his influence as a catalyst in nature for plant regeneration and possibly on a human level, reincarnation. He was the most popular ancient Egyptian god, being fundamental to their religious thinking from early times. His tragic but symbolic death, being cut into pieces by his jealous brother Seth and then magically reconstructed by his wife Isis, communicated more than a dramatic story, but rather complex spiritual doctrines in simple parable form. At left, the ceremonial raising of the Djed column signifies a resurrected life that can now take a place with other luminous beings in the solar boat of Ra on the voyage of millions and millions of years. Nearby the main temple is a curious structure called the Osirion. Mostly underground and flooded, it is constructed of massive granite blocks that suggest an architectural style from the earliest period. The myths of Osiris are believed to have been dramatically reenacted here, performing as a symbolic cauldron of transformation. Osiris was a sympathetic, personal god and role model to the ancient Egyptians. He offered inspiration and hope for them in his death and restoration, foreshadowing a similar reverence for Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. A planned journey sometimes has an unexpected detour. At these times, the traveler can be confronted by a strange discovery. Ancient Egyptian history might appear to follow a predetermined plan from its earliest dynasties, but one era certainly stands out from all the rest and still challenges us today. On this desert plain, where no temples had ever been built, a pharaoh named Akhenaten brought forth a revolutionary spiritual vision. Marking this new theological frontier are what is known as boundary stelae, and like modern signposts, they are some of the first proclamations in history for the belief in monotheism. Here, Akhenaten makes an offering to the sun disk called Aten, his only god, and then is revitalized along with his family by its rays of solar life force. This is a glimpse of the famous Amarna art style, which is different from ancient Egypt's traditional design. What can be the reason for this departure? Examining Akhenaten's image closely, diverse racial features seem to be deliberately added to his face. When included with his accentuated breasts and hips, there leaves the impression that Akhenaten wanted to be visually accessible to everyone. With the pharaoh considered a reflection of the divine, Akhenaten's concept of himself as such a symbol was to be individual as well as universal. He is considered the first personality in history and declares for the ages that the one God manifests differently to different people but gives spiritual enlightenment to all. Sharing in this dream was Nefertiti, shining through the ages like a beacon of classic beauty that sets a standard even today. Some scholars say she ruled Egypt equally alongside her husband, and alone after his mysterious death. What is more certain, with her own personality, she helped shape and promote the high spiritual ideals of the Amarna dream. This dream of a united world under one supreme being was the legacy of their time, and still attracts interest today. Not far from Amarna, but on the west bank of the Nile, the baboon stares in awe at the setting sun, standing guard at the gates to knowledge. Although we can now only ponder an eerie panorama of ruins, this was once a great center of learning, dedicated to the god Thoth, master of words and all wisdom. His other sacred animal, the ibis, functionally symbolized a quest for knowledge because of its highly selective eating habits. Hermopolis was also known as the City of Eight, adopting this number for infinity as the metaphysical key to its unique perspective on creation. As Pythagoras and the Jewish Kabbalah would later teach, numbers offer insight into the developing order of nature. To the ancient Egyptians, 8 signified death, sex, and regeneration as old cells divide to form new in a certain numerical progression which manifests the physical world. This is biologically demonstrated by male sperm fertilizing the female egg. For an instant they become one, then split into 2 new cells that eventually become 4, then 8, which becomes 1 again. The completed human embryo. By traveling north to the ancient capital of Lower Egypt and further back in time to at least 2,500 years before Christ, another perspective on our physical world can be discovered. Not much remains today of this once glorious city dedicated to the god Ptah. This mummified creator employed thoughts and words to both conceive and manifest. He symbolized the primal fire or energy that is bound within matter. Ptah was a god identified with craftsmen like the god Khunuum, and with his green coloring also related to plants and nature. What does remain of Memphis is a colossal statue of prodigious builder, Pharaoh Ramesses II, now taking a rest on his back. This craftsman weaves many threads together to create a cohesive whole. The ancient Egyptians wove art, science, and religion together to create a holistic pattern of thinking that governed their intent and actions. Presiding over the lush countryside, not far from Memphis, stands the first completed pyramid, architectural symbol of ancient Egypt. It is known as the Step Pyramid of King Djoser, and was built on top of an existing square tomb to a height of 6 tiers or steps. Since 6 is the number of the physical world, possibly embodied in this burial pyramid was the idea of completing our earthly existence. It is considered one of the first large-scale stone monuments, designed by the immortalized genius of the arts and sciences, Imhotep. The Step Pyramid was part of a bigger complex considered the favored entombment site throughout ancient Egyptian history. Imhotep's creative vision begins at the outer entrance. His stylish indented enclosure walls have inspired many a modern architect. The rather small doorway psychologically concentrates our perceptions to be released only after passing through to the inner colonnade. These columns connected to solid walls have an outer casing resembling bundles of tied reeds. Like other temples, the stonework here is given the nourishing essence of nature. Along the Royal Causeway are picturesque scenes of daily life that form a stream of consciousness between now and the hereafter. Here is an actual archaeological dig, the exploration of a shaft tomb. These were set deep into the ground with a crypt at the bottom. They were considered impenetrable to grave robbers after closing, but time and determination have still left their scars. Numerous open pits attest to the popularity of such a burial technique. Inside the Pyramid of Unas and inscribed on the tomb's inner walls can be found source material for the Book of the Dead, or more accurately, the Book of Coming Forth into Light. This details the soul's journey after death. At the Hall of Judgment, the deceased must witness their heart being weighed against a feather of the goddess Mahat, who symbolizes truth, justice and order. Performing this ritual is the wolf-headed god, Anubis. If the soul is not living a harmonious life and heavier than this feather, then it will be eaten by the crocodile-headed god, Ammit. This could mean annihilation or maybe a demotion back to nature. When in balance, the Ka or personal soul is reconciled with the Ba or universal, eternal soul to unite with the gods, the Shining Ones or Netters. During the opening of the mouth funeral ritual for the deceased, the high priest chants, Ankh Ba, the soul lives. In the extensive pyramid fields from Saqqara to Cairo there is another Old Kingdom burial site. Here are architectural remnants from a period after the Great Pyramid building dynasty. Its 3 pyramids are on a smaller scale and not as well constructed as those found at Giza. This could be an example supporting the theory that the ancient Egyptian civilization is not necessarily a simple progression from earlier to later times, but rather the opposite, an actual decline from an advanced state or golden age around the 4th dynasty, 25 to 2600 BC. Archaeological evidence for an early stage of development is unclear, and it appears they were almost fully developed from the earliest dynasties. present capital of Egypt, a city as legendary as the river Nile that divides it. There are the typical modern high-rise office buildings, and city life is very intense here. Everything and everybody must pass through it, occasionally at the same time. Never far from view is the Old Cairo. Its captivating skyline of stately domes and graceful minarets is a constant reminder that Cairo, an important Islamic center, is home to some of the world's greatest mosques. Their exquisitely embellished interiors create a mystical atmosphere that is favorably directed towards bringing the faithful close to the God, Allah, the one and only. Besides a belief in one God, Judaism and Islam both have a prohibition against images of their God. Islam has compensated for this by creating elaborate, yet intricate, graphic designs that still provide visual insight into the spiritual dimension. The marketplace is another distinct aspect of Arab life. Its twisting streets are filled with exotic shops where almost anything can be bought or sold, if you can bargain for it. The youth of this vibrant city would like to greet you. Cairo has the newest as well as some of the oldest pyramids in the world. This one functions as a final resting place for a great leader, a man of peace, Anwar Sadat. What better legacy could an advanced civilization leave to the future than the masterpieces in stone found on this nearby plateau? Like a time capsule that contains records of past achievement, these pyramids can be viewed as a similar depository of knowledge. Here the ancient Egyptians embodied in stone not only the wealth of their technical and metaphysical knowledge, but did it in such an ingenious way that translation requires an equally advanced civilization. A pyramid shape symbolizes dedication to a higher ideal which America's founding fathers recognized by using it for the country's Great Seal. To build these pyramids required an incredibly organized society. Orthodox archaeology still maintains that the pyramids were built solely as burial places for Pharaoh, and many were for that function. But the Great Pyramid, officially credited to the pharaoh Khufu, diverges from this premise, and more than a mummy can be discovered here. There are many theories surrounding its true purpose, but first it should be recognized as a sophisticated tool for measurement, a survey marker for our terrestrial world. This is demonstrated by its almost perfect alignment to the four directions and its location at the center of the Earth's collective landmass. From its dimensions can be extrapolated the proportional circumference of the Earth, longitude, latitude, and the Earth's rotation. It can also be viewed as a scale model of the Northern Hemisphere, and with its concave sides formed a rare 8 rather than 4-sided pyramid. Built using the geometric irrationals pi and phi, the Great Pyramid speaks more than any written record of what the ancient Egyptians knew about their world and maybe beyond. Not seemingly created for practicality, the Great Pyramid might have been created to alter reality. When someone enters its inner space, they become part of a resonant environment intentionally constructed to harness and channel a spectrum of subtle energies. This could elicit in a person what might be called a higher state of consciousness and considered a spiritual technology. The technicians who knew how to operate this mechanism would certainly be an elite priesthood who might use it for their religious rituals. Viewed from this perspective, could the Great Pyramid be a grand initiation center where select disciples experienced an orchestrated enhancement of its power? From this open sarcophagus, did they have access to the multiple, unseen dimensions of quantum physics which would allow the spirit energy to travel freely like subatomic waves and particles? Could such spirit or soul energy purposely released and projected through time and space be the avatars or prophets of future times? The Great Pyramid might ultimately demonstrate that consciousness is really the fundamental element and matter just derived from it. The Great Pyramid's massive stonework is so precisely cut and fitted there is barely a joint between blocks. Its highly polished white casing stones made it appear like a luminous beacon that could be seen over great distances, even from outer space. If we accept the Great Pyramid as a model of Earth, then the two smaller pyramids of Pharaoh Khafre and Menkaure could represent Venus and Mercury in their orbits relative to the Sun. There is also another interesting relationship between these three pyramids and the three brightest stars in the Orion constellation belt. But where did such knowledge originate? A clue to the answer is actually not very far from here, as if the ancient Egyptians anticipated our exploration into their time. Rising from the desert floor, the noble Sphinx greets us with a serene expression of timelessness. Cut from a single giant outcropping of rock, if there was anything man-made that could be considered eternal, it would be the Sphinx. Characteristically different from the rest of ancient Egyptian architecture, its weathered features are a source of debate over being caused by water rather than wind erosion. This would imply that the Great Sphinx had been subjected to abundant rainfall in a period before its accepted construction by Pharaoh Khafre around 2500 BC. Since the body of the Sphinx appears to be that of a lion, could an earlier megalithic version also have a lion's head? The discovery of massive Neolithic temples at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey has altered historical timelines about the rise of civilization back to around 9000 BC or the end of the last ice age. Since recent analysis of ancient Egyptian mummies reveal they share DNA from this region known in the past as the Anatolia, there may be a connection. If the astrological age of Leo was loosely between 10,000 and 8,000 BC, could migrants from the Göbekli Tepe area have created an original ceremonial lion statue whose head was later fashioned into that of a pharaoh? Since there is a relationship between opposite sun signs, the riddle of the Sphinx, born in the age of Leo, might be revealed in the emerging age of Aquarius. The Giza Plateau was certainly considered a sacred place in the past, and there is still considerably more to discover about it. The opinion that the Great Sphinx is solely attributed to the reign of Pharaoh Khafre is subject to many probing questions. It may have been part of a previous sacred site built by migrating Neolithic peoples who had developed many advanced skills. Plato wrote about a more ancient civilization called Atlantis, which was destroyed in an earthly cataclysm. Survivors might have established colonies for the ordained purpose of preserving their wisdom and set the rigid standards which the ancient Egyptian civilization followed for more than 3,000 years. Everything essential to their culture is evident there from the earliest dynasties. Such enlightenment forms the foundation of Western civilization in a much deeper sense than is now acknowledged. In this light, it could be considered an incubator for humanity's growth. How many souls were cultivated in ancient Egypt through multiple reincarnations to resurrect what was lost? Are they like Noah's descendants after the biblical Great Flood? The collapse of an Atlantis or Göbekli Tepe might have coincided with the creation of the Sphinx, and it could be their legacy to us. a legacy that is like a ray of hope for the dark days of a destructive, alienated world, because the Great Sphinx is an eternal symbol in stone for a spiritual dawn. North of the Giza Plateau in a Cairo suburb is an ancient city known in the Bible as On. Not much remains today of its past glory, especially its famous university, considered the first in the world. Here many of our cherished Greeks such as Plato and Pythagoras learned fragments of the ancient Egyptians' wisdom. They then interpreted it from their own perspective, eventually becoming the analytical sciences and philosophy known today. It is recorded in the Bible that Christ was brought here as a child while seeking refuge in Egypt. Heliopolis was the inner mind of Egypt, the major temple for the supreme solar god, Ra, and his manifestations as dawn and dusk, Khepri and Atum. Its sacred birds were the falcon, exalting its visionary powers and dominion. Also the Bennu, that symbolizes the eternal spirit, the light that mysteriously rises from the darkness like a mythic phoenix. Many obelisks were taken from here and other sites in Egypt to be re-erected in various Western capitals. They are Istanbul, Rome, Paris, London, and, in New York. The largest obelisk in the world is in Washington, D.C., dedicated to the United States' first president, George Washington. Like him, a majority of the founding fathers were Masons who traced their tradition back to ancient Egypt. Aware of the symbolic nature of obelisks and pyramids, they formed the American nation on a secret foundation of transcendent principles which are like seeds that would someday bear fruit. The obelisk, born in the past, ultimately symbolizes a future world, unified for collective survival through our spiritual nature and affirming values harmonious with life on Earth. Can this ancient Egyptian monolith inspire a new system of government that could solve the critical problems facing humanity today so that we do have tomorrow? Will all peoples, someday, come together as one, under the sun?